On this episode of China Unscripted, China is running out of money. That doesn't mean they've given up on trying to take over the world. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Chong.
And I'm Matt Ganeshta.
Oh boy, and the news today. China has another map.
Another map.
Another map. I mean, they got tired of using like 500-year-old maps to justify bizarre territorial claims. Now they're just making new maps.
With new territorial claims?
With new territorial claims. It just keeps expanding. I mean, there was when was that? That was still this year. Maybe like a month or two ago. China came out with a new map and it expanded the 9-dash line. You know, the 9-dash line was, we'll put it on screen, basically claiming all of the South China Sea.
And that wasn't enough.
No. Then they added like another dash to the line. Took some of India's territory on that map and some of Russia's territory, including the port city of Vladivostok.
Oh, I'm sure that map was just
It was the official map.
Did anybody say anything about this? Like, did Russia go, hey?
No, because they desperately need China.
That's true. At the moment. At this point, Russia's just going to be like, we never had Vladivostok in exchange for money.
Worthless UN.
Well, it's not worthless if they'll give their... I mean, I think it's actually not worthless for Russia because they've been completely shut out of...
Oh, that's true. However, and I know Matt had a good point about how the UN is critically tied to essentially foreign investment in China. I don't know if we want to go down to that route.
Well, yeah, I mean, the basic thing is that China cannot maintain the value of the yuan, the renminbi, unless it continues to get direct foreign investment, which is why China is absolutely desperate to get more foreign investment because foreign investment is at a 30-year low right now. But I think maybe we'll talk about that more later on the episode because right now the real issue is that China is expanding its maps now in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is that sort of alcove between Hainan Island and northern Vietnam.
And I love the excuse of how they did it. Like, so the example we've given is like Norway has all these fjords, and so like it's all like, jaggedy on the map.
Right. And so the United Nations law of the sea allows countries to basically draw like kind of straight lines or like smooth it out, right? For like just what is the official coastline. And the reason the official coastline is important is that it determines a country's territorial waters. And then further out is the exclusive economic zone.
Yeah.
So how you draw your coastline does affect how much control you have over the ocean territory in that vicinity.
Exactly. And, Hainan Island on China, it has all these fjords. And so China had
It has all these fjords.
Shut up, Shelley. So they just had to smooth it out a little bit, According to the UN law, China and the South China Sea, they always follow UN law and ruling.
Yes,
right. Well, they smoothed it out from the border between China and Vietnam over to like these tiny islands to then like, the middle of Hainan Island. And I think that looks pretty smooth. And then all that area to the northeast is
now suddenly part of China?
Is now suddenly part of China. Just like full on, it's China.
I mean, is the Gulf of Tonkin really important?
Well, you're making that point, but that's how salami slicing, as it's called, works. They just keep pushing the line. They just slice off another little thin piece of that salami. And you're like, it's not worth going to war or making a big fuss out of. And then someday, China's got all the salami.
It's death by 1,000 salami slices.
Exactly. Well, I mean, we have seen this actually happen, like with the artificial islands in the South China Sea that they started building around 2012. They built these islands, and everyone was like, "Hey, stop." And they didn't.
No, but they're like, we're not going to militarize them.
Well, no. First it was then don't build them, and they went and built them, and then they were like, okay, you built them, just don't militarize them.
Yeah, Xi Jinping promised not to militarize them, right? At like a press conference on the White House lawn.
Yeah, I think they had that nice little rose garden walk, Obama and Xi, someplace in California. I've been there. And they have a little plaque about, oh, this is where Xi Jinping and Obama were. And I stood there wishing I could exist in multiple spaces and times at once so I could go back and just slap them both.
Okay.
I got kicked out.
Of the Rose Garden.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I was just trying to go Super Saiyan in
Uh-huh.
the middle of the Rose Garden.
Okay. So
all right.
the point is that the Chinese Communist Party has repeatedly broken its promises, and now they've heavily militarized several islands in the South China Sea.
Yeah, and so, this is the salami slicing. If nobody pushes back,
they're going to eat all your salami.
They're going to eat all the salami. And the sad thing is, Vietnam didn't do a great job with this one. They like issued a statement saying that China should follow UN law or something.
And China's probably like, but we are following UN law, the law of the sea. It allows us to smooth out the coastline.
But not the part where we have to not claim territories belonging to the Philippines. That is not part of the UN law of the sea.
Well, so this is where I think the Philippines, especially recently, has been doing a much better job combating China's salami slicing because they're actually doing something.
I mean, not just saying, don't do this.
Yeah, please stop doing this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think what was the latest thing that last week, the Philippines had 2 government ships where they were transporting some scientists over to an unoccupied reef to do some, I don't know, marine biology research or whatever. And then the Chinese Coast Guard with a military helicopter were trying to harass them and like drive them away from, again, this unoccupied reef. And from the Philippine side, they were just like, hey, we're just doing science here. And, the Chinese press release was much more like, we ejected these like Filipino, we boarded the reefs and we defended them heroically. Like it was really, a very different story that they were telling.
Very interesting.
But I think it's also interesting because the Philippines, in a way, was doing something that kind of turned like some of the CCP's tactics against themselves, where, for years the CCP has tried to be like, oh, well, we're just in Antarctica. We are just conducting science. We're building scientific bases, which everyone's allowed to do. And, it's pretty clear that they are trying to claim Antarctica.
Yeah, that the scientists are just basically government agents.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying the Philippines have like a nefarious, like they could actually be doing science. I'm just saying that they're now saying, okay, well, we're doing science. What are you going to do about it?
I love how people talk about science like it's wizardry, like this mysterious thing.
We are doing science.
Prepare to conduct science.
Yeah. I mean, it is a type of wizardry. Remember Mr. Wizard?
Oh, wow. I do.
I also do. Kind of, but like my grasp of English wasn't that good at the time I was watching Mr. Wizard, so I found it a little slow.
Both a scientist and a wizard.
Yeah. Mr. Wizard, the original Bill Nye.
Yeah,
that's right.
It is kind of disappointing how like science actually works because it's usually like somebody getting a lot of expertise on like this one very narrow specific thing and not knowing anything outside that little bubble. Whereas like from the Avengers, we get the idea of like, oh, scientists can make like a time machine and a super weapon and, cool stuff.
And like Tony Stark and, oh my God, the Hulk. I forget his actual name. Bruce Banner. Or they're like, oh, science bros. Have you seen those memes where it's kind of, it's about Bruce Banner and Tony Stark being science bros together, and they science all the science as science bros. So it's what you're talking about, where it's like they can do anything. Yes.
Which is not it's not true. It's like scientists like gradually add just a little bit. It's like reverse salami slicing. They give back a little bit of salami to the larger body of human knowledge gradually over time.
I see. So they're slowly making salami.
Yes, that's what scientists do. This is why you watch China Unscripted.
For our stunning metaphors.
Yes. So China's salami slicing, it does have very real impact on Taiwan. And you see the same strategy being used against Taiwan, how China has been now conducting like these military drills very close to Taiwan, kind of normalizing it.
Mm-hmm. Also what's happening with now like the outlying islands like Jingmen.
Yeah.
Yeah, Penghu Matsu, where it's kind of like they're increasing these Chinese Coast Guard patrols
Mm.
in the area.
They
and-
boarded that Taiwanese like tour boat.
Yes. I mean, it's obviously trying to intimidate and freak people out.
The Taiwan should have said they were all scientists.
I mean, I'm not sure that would have stopped the Chinese government from boarding.
true.
Yeah.
Well, though, you know, what's interesting is that when we went to Jinmen in 2018, like, you know, there's a lot of pro-China or pro-Beijing kind of sentiment there.
I mean, they are right next to China.
Right.
You can see it.
They're like right off the coast of Xiamen. Yeah, I mean, we stood on the beach and like you could see mainland like right across the water. It's like 2 miles away.
Yeah, there's like this hazy red and low hum that would penetrate your brain.
And there was like like an eye on fire in the distance.
Yeah.
That was your
Something
GoPro.
deep from the sea.
Yeah, I mean, but I think like when the CCP does things like board a tourist boat or have an extreme reaction to something Taiwan does legitimately, it makes people in Taiwan, instead of being scared of the CCP, they just get angry.
I think that's true for people on the mainland Taiwan island. I don't know how people on Jimen are reacting to this, actually.
Yeah, well, I would be angry. And it seems that the US has actually responded to this, or if not responded directly to this incident, has done something that has that same impact, which is putting US troops on Jinmen.
Oh, I think the U.S. troops are already there.
Right. That's why I don't know the timeline. But it pushes back against the CCP.
I think but the fact that the news that there are U.S. Green Berets on these outlying islands like Jinmen and Penghu training Taiwanese military, like that, leak or whatever I think that is the response.
Right. It's clearly calculated. And I think, obviously this angers China. But what it does is that the more you put U.S. troops in different areas of Taiwan, the riskier it becomes for the CCP to invade. Because if they try to invade Taiwan and U.S. troops are killed, then the U.S. government politically, no matter which administration it is going to politically have no choice but to get involved. Or at least it gives them an excuse to get involved. Whereas if there's no American casualties, there will be people in Congress who say, oh, we really don't want to go to another war, and they can delay it. Even if they delay it 3 days, that's too long, right? The response has to happen immediately. And so every single additional troop stationed in Taiwan reduces the likelihood of the CCP invading Taiwan.
I mean, I think, yes, that's obviously a warning, right? Just letting it be known that there are U.S. troops on these outlying islands makes it harder for the CCP to be like, oh, well, let's just take Jinmen and see what happens.
Right.
Maybe we can slice off this section of the Salami and, Taiwan won't be able to do anything. The U.S. won't be able to do anything.
Just smooth the map a little bit to encompass all of Taiwan.
I mean, first you want to start with Jinmen and some of the outlying islands.
The uninhabited ones.
Yeah.
Well,
then
Jinmen's habited.
Yeah, but then you slowly, go for Taiwan,
Right.
the entire Salami.
I mean, most of China's new territorial claims in the last 2 decades have been uninhabited areas that they then put people onto, right? Like the South China Sea, those islands that they claimed were not even really islands at the time. They were just reefs, right? And they make them, there was no one living there. They make them into islands and then put people there to sort of colonize them, right? Similar with like the part of Russia they first claimed was like this little island in a river, which is like, oh, no big deal, right? Or like a lot of the border with India, I mean, outside of the military station there, like people aren't really living there because it's just it's like a
brutal and high in the
high altitude,
Himalayas.
cold. Yeah. So, you kind of start with those things and you gauge the pushback. Obviously, Taiwan's a whole another animal because there's like millions of people living in Taiwan. And that's, there's going to be loss of life. And then the pushback becomes really real.
Yeah, the Indian border is a good example of how the salami slicing works. There's like this kind of nebulous border in like a very hostile environment. So China builds its, little outpost a little closer to the India side, a little further, a little further, a little further. It's
Or
like
they're
Bhutan.
building roads and things like that in the last 5 or 6 years. I
To
think
get people there quickly.
there was also they basically took over some parts of Nepal
Yeah.
by just like building a few villages like right over the border
Yeah.
and like moving people there and then slowly kind of encroaching on. And then Nepal is also pretty dependent on the CCP. I don't know if this is still the case, but for many years they had a communist government, right?
Oh, yeah.
So they're not going to say anything, right? Because they depend so much on the CCP for trade and for all these things. So just slowly they can take over that territory.
Right. At least, I give props to the Indian government for pushing back, which they've done in a lot of ways. But the latest thing is they've built this high altitude tunnel that leads up to the part of the border area, which is in itself, a tremendous feat of technology, but also, science and wizardry combined. But this tunnel also will allow them to transport troops and supplies in, even if there's difficult weather conditions.
Which, of course, means that the Chinese Communist Party is very upset that India is encroaching upon Chinese territory in Arunachal Pradesh with, their tunnel.
Right.
How dare they?
How dare India do its own economic development?
But this is how you use the tactics against them, because like if you start to salami slice China, they are in the same situation of like, okay, what really are we going to do to push back against this Indian tunnel? Nothing.
Yeah.
Especially because didn't the U.S. like acknowledge that the Arunachal Pradesh belongs to India?
The
tunnel?
U.S. State Department released a statement that said that the U.S. supports India and that Arunachal Pradesh is a Indian territory.
And considering like I'm not a huge fan of the State Department, like that's still.
I also But what's interesting then is, of course, China's foreign ministry was very upset about it. So all the news articles I saw were kind of, the framing was that China gets angry over the U.S. interfering.
China slams.
Yeah, the U.S. interference in its border dispute with India. I mean, whereas the U.S. was just kind of just stating the U.S. policy, which has always been the U.S. policy, that they recognize this as Indian territory. It's not like they're doing something new, right? But yeah, the framing of it is always like, oh, well,
It angers China.
Yeah.
I wonder where that comes from. If it's like an actual like ideological alignment with China, or if it's just like, okay, how we're all the media is dying. How do we create?
I mean, you always want to
slapping
look
headlines?
like you always want to look for conflict in a headline, right? So
I mean,
yeah.
we do that too. So
I mean, yes, YouTube titles
forces
are
it.
same. So I mean, I suppose news organizations would argue that the internet forces it or something, or like people will only click if it's
Right.
Whatever.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, that's, and there are some YouTube channels like Last Week Tonight that doesn't do catchy headlines, but I believe they also get additional help from YouTube to be promoted. So, and I haven't seen actual evidence of that, but it's weird how like certain things get promoted so much, even if you don't watch them.
I mean, I think
See
it's
them on your
definitely,
feed.
you can definitely see YouTube over the last, I mean, this is total tangent, but you can see YouTube over the last decade or so moving further and further away from small creators and, kind of like this idea of like fostering like these YouTube celebrities and moving more and more towards like corporate content.
Right. So it's not YouTube, it's corporate tube.
So
So the only solution is for us to be a corporate.
It's not YouTube, it's our tube.
is that like the
I mean, that's definitely a better line than the one I came up with.
Yeah. But
and it's not your territory, it's our territory.
Hey, you brought it back.
Yeah, there we go.
But yeah, so this is where it's critical for all countries to actually like figure out a way to stand up to the salami slicing tactic, because if you don't, the line will just keep being pushed further.
Yeah, I mean, even things like, Chinese fishing vessels roaming the seas and, you know, taking all the fish off the coast of Africa or South America,
Yeah,
like
that
all these.
doesn't get talked about enough. I feel like that's not in the general
Yeah.
public
Well,
consciousness.
a
I feel
lot
like
of
China's killing and taking all the fish all over the world.
yeah, well, a big reason for that is that
Americans don't like seafood.
I was gonna say that it's because a lot of the countries off of whose coast Chinese deep sea fishermen are overfishing. Those are countries like they either are already kind of in bed with the CCP, or they're heavily dependent on the CCP, or they're simply too poor and lack the resources to do anything about it. Because it does take resources to push back against. You get 100 of these, maritime militia or just regular fishing boats in your territory. Like, what do you do if your country only has like 2 Coast Guard ships and they're small?
It also helps that like these are countries that most Americans have never heard of or could certainly not put on a map, like Mauritania.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Like I was reading up about the rubber terror. That was part of Belgium's colonization of the Congo,
Uh-huh.
and it's like it's a nightmare. People didn't hear about it. People don't know about it because it was far away.
Yeah, the Belgians were not good colonizers. No.
Were there good colonizers, Shelley?
Yeah. So the Chinese Communist Party.
Yes, there we
When
go.
they colonize, we use that word. They colonized. These islands, yeah.
Yeah. Well, they colonized the islands. They colonized Tibet. They colonized southern Mongolia. They
African
colonized
analysts
Xinjiang.
have called what they're doing in Africa colonialism, very similar to what they're doing in Latin America too.
I mean, look, everything that the CCP accuses the West of doing, they are doing themselves. Like, that's just
What's
like
that called? The iron law of woke projection. I think that's the term going around the internets these days.
Are you saying the CCP is extremely woke?
It's Marxist. It's all the same ideology.
Well, in the sense of it's, oppressor versus oppressed, the sort of
But
class struggle.
miraculously, the CCP is never the oppressor.
Yeah, no matter how much power and authority it gets.
They're definitely the oppressed.
Yes.
And speaking on behalf of the oppressed.
That's why they're a developing country still.
Yeah.
Speaking of them totally not being oppressors, Hong Kong, where they're doing a different type of salami slicing, which is a legal salami slicing.
What kind of, I was going to say, like, people's rights and freedoms salami slicing? Like,
Yes, but it is, though.
Yeah.
It is.
It is a good point because, they have been slowly encroaching. Actually, Hong Kong is a perfect example of this because they have been slowly encroaching. When they got too much pushback, they would back off a bit. And so this week or last week now when this comes out.
Last week, yeah.
Article 23 just got passed. It's this horrible, anything can be a national security violation.
It
and you can go
basically
to
makes
jail
things
for
that
life.
are illegal in China also illegal in Hong Kong.
Yes. So, for example, if some Westerner gave a donation to a Hong Kong nonprofit or charity that was advocating for democracy, okay, now everyone in there can be accused of
like accepting hostile foreign
Like
and
it's
violating
contributions
national
or something.
security.
yeah, there's actually a term for it which I'm forgetting right now, but it's like foreign
interference.
Mm. And it was different from foreign interference.
Foreign funding, but so something like that. So what happened? Because I actually remember reading about Article 23 when the legislature tried to pass it in 2003. So 21 years ago. Oh my gosh, it's a long time ago. And
Well-
like people protested. They were so angry.
There were 500,000 people took to the streets, which was at the time the biggest protest
Right.
that Hong Kong had seen.
Yeah.
And so
And the party backed off because
Right.
that was a big reaction.
And the party knew also, I think even now, they couldn't just pass it straight up. So they had to actually lay the groundwork for it, which they've been doing for years, is laying the groundwork so that they could pass it without pushback. You have to eliminate the pushback before the pushback happens.
Yeah, that's kind of what was going on way back with the umbrella protest, where it's like there was this promise that Hong Kongers would eventually get to elect their own
chief
executive
Directly.
directly.
Like instead of the way it was set up so that all these special interest groups get to elect the chief executive, many of them controlled by China.
Yeah.
Right.
So the party was eventually like, okay, you get to vote, but it's only pre-approved candidates that we select. And there was a pushback against that. And so the party was like, okay, we keep the old system.
Nobody gets to vote for, but
Yeah.
you will never get to vote for your chief executive
Yeah.
directly.
So it's like that kind of salami slicing. And then with, there was the
There was
500,000
yeah.
protests. And then it come 2019, that we get like 1 million people, 2 million people. We were at the 2 million people.
Right. I mean,
protest.
that was over like this extradition bill that would have
Yeah.
allowed, in certain cases, them to take someone charged with a crime in Hong Kong to be extradited to mainland China for trial.
Which even that's salami slicing.
Yeah.
Yes, because that's the Hong Kong legal system was supposed to be firewalled from the Chinese legal system.
And I think the CCP miscalculated. They took too big of a slice at once, because what they didn't realize is that a lot of different segments of society would be scared of that. Like, it wasn't just powerless dissidents who were scared of that. It was also like a lot of people who did business in Hong Kong were scared, because they're like, oh, like all this so-called anti-corruption stuff that Xi Jinping is doing, like what if he comes after, executives in our company?
And
The whole society was basically, from top to bottom, was scared of this.
And I think the CCP freaked out by that reaction, and then which is why they pushed so hard on Hong Kong. And that did not go well for Hong Kong, but I think in the long run, that really screwed the Chinese Communist Party, which I'll talk about in a bit. But what ended up happening was, so the party basically cracked down, so there couldn't really be these large-scale protests
Right.
anymore.
The National Security Law of 2020.
I mean, they were very helped by COVID, right? Because first they could put in place.
It was for health. You
Yeah,
couldn't protest.
you couldn't
gather.
have more than 3 people together in public in Hong Kong, right?
Right.
So you could immediately eliminate any protest.
And you couldn't put up Post-it notes anymore, because that's also a public health crisis.
But
I mean-
eventually, yes, they got to what you're talking about.
Right. That sort of, and yeah, exactly. So now they've stopped the protests.
Well, and then
which
also
is key.
they took control of the legislative and the judicial in Hong Kong. They got all of the pro-democracy, not even pro-democracy.
No, I mean, democracy, like pro-democracy.
I-
The legislature had a minority for a long time that was pretty pro-democracy, and it was always
they were able to stop certain bills.
yes,
essentially.
and it was always a minority because it was
Most-
rigged so
Yeah.
that you could only directly elect a certain number of representatives, and the other ones were again elected by these special interest groups. So it was always rigged, but they managed to have a big enough minority to stop certain things,
Right.
you're saying.
And I remember when we went to Hong Kong in, I think it was 2016, and we interviewed some people in the legislature who were pro-democracy,
Oh yeah,
right? Including, I remember long hair.
Yeah,
Um,
poor guy.
there was something about Salami in that interview.
About baloney. I
Oh,
think
baloney.
he threw baloney. at
Threw
someone.
baloney. So, anyways, he was a very funny guy, but also someone like him could never be in the legislature now.
I mean, they basically disqualified all the pro-democracy candidates. They arrested a bunch of them for daring to have primary elections. Essentially, the pro-democracy candidates tried to hold a private primary to determine who was going to run in each district, so that they wouldn't be competing against each other.
Right.
And that was unfortunately the month after the national security law came into effect. So then
Yeah.
the CCP was able to arrest everyone under the national security law.
Right.
So now there are pretty much no pro-democracy people.
Right. And in terms of national security cases, there's only a small handful of judges that are actually handling these. I believe the number is less than half a dozen judges who are actually the ones handling it. So all the CCP has to do is replace a few judges, pressure a few people to retire, put in some new people, and then assign them to the national security stuff. And then that's
Yeah, there's a special
that's
national
enough.
security court that they set up under
Yeah.
the national security law. So
And it's harder to defend yourself there because they have restrictions on your legal counsel, and they can hold you in detention without bail in a way that they couldn't have done 5 years ago.
It's very much like China. But yeah, so they took
It's
out.
interesting.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I was just thinking about how like they wanted to extradite people to mainland China, and Hong Kongers rebelled against that, so they had to back down. Now they're like, "We'll bring mainland China's court system to you."
Basically. But yeah, so they took over the courts, the government. They did something with the Hong Kong police, because the Hong Kong police we saw when we were there for the umbrella protests in 2014 was not the same kind of police that were there in 2019. They were either trained by the mainland or just directly mainland police. Um, and so now, and then they made it so you can protest. And so when they rolled out with Article 23, passed.
Yeah, and it's
Salami
interesting
sliced.
because the Article 23 does some of the same things as the national security law does, but now the CCP can use the excuse of like, oh well, because the national security law was imposed by China's legislature on Hong Kong. So now the CCP can be like, well, Hong Kong passed Article 23 all by
passed it.
themselves. The legislature, like passed it and rubber stamped it. So now this is a Hong Kong law. Like they can kind of
Well,
use that to
it's
muddy the waters.
and it's very popular in Hong Kong because it was a unanimous vote in favor of Article 23.
Yes, everybody
you
wanted
go.
it to make Hong Kong more stable,
Yes.
just like mainland China.
It's amazing how the party will use like these little tricks to make it seem like, there's democracy going on, and it does trick people in the West. Like Deng Xiaoping's whole thing was he kind of came up with the collective leadership that China had for a long time. Basically, after Mao, the core leader, died, Deng Xiaoping rehabilitated all the people he purged, and they were all indebted to him, and so he came up with this kind of collective leadership thing, which is basically
But
how.
I mean, like Deng was still in charge.
Yeah, well, because everyone was indebted to him for this whole thing of rehabilitating everybody. So even though he was never the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, he was essentially the paramount leader. But in his whole reform and opening up to the West, this was a part of how he tricked the West to be like, yeah, this really is reform. We're not, this
There's no
one man
strong
strong man
man,
leader.
yeah.
We have collective leadership. Yeah, it's the party, but we're headed to democracy. Give us money.
The running over students with tanks was a minor speed bump on the road to democracy.
Don't worry, the tanks barely felt it.
Oh
Oh.
Yeah. Oh, but I think that's a good transition to stupid Western investors. But just to go back to the Hong Kong thing, because I kind of teased this, even though the party did this very aggressive salami slicing, I want a cold cut for lunch. I think ultimately that did backfire for them because number one, Taiwan saw that.
hmm
And that was the moment where they were like, whoa, there is never going to be a one country, two system solution to Taiwan,
yeah.
China. And also it was a big PR nightmare for the Chinese Communist Party globally because people saw hey, the Hong Kongers, they're begging for freedom, begging for America to do something.
And the American Congress responded by passing all these laws about, it's just interesting because when we talked to Hong Kong protesters back in 2019, the summer of 2019 and the fall of 2019, I remember very clearly that many of them kind of knew that it was ultimately going to be a losing battle.
Yeah.
But they just felt like they were going to go down fighting because maybe essentially the rest of the world would finally wake up to what the CCP was like instead of enabling all of this.
Yeah, and I think that was the beginning to a lot of. I think that was the beginning of Western investment being maybe
Because Hong Kong was actually a pretty important part of the Western investment into China, right?
Actually, that's another good example of how China did salami slicing with Hong Kong. Initially, that was especially after Mao's days. Hong Kong was the main source of financial investment from the rest of the world, and they used that to build up the rest of China. And then they built up other economic centers like Shenzhen
Or Shanghai.
to replace the importance of Hong Kong. So it weakened Hong Kong.
So that eventually, if they took it over, it wasn't going to be such a big deal anymore.
Yeah.
It's kind of incredible when you look at the gradualism of all this stuff, and so it makes us seem crazy because we were from 2012 talking about how dangerous this all is, and then it takes more than a decade for it to manifest, right? About actually, yes, this was terrible. I think it's weird thinking back to what people thought of China even just in 2012, because you were talking about Taiwan. Ma Ying-jeou was the president of Taiwan at the time. He was the head of the KMT, and he was totally on this, like, we should sign a trade deal with China. We should, normalize relations and get closer. And he met with Xi Jinping. Was it in Singapore? Where was it? Like,
It was a
Something
third
like that.
a third country.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so that was like the closest, like it really looked like. It's kind of weird to think back on it now because, now, like you said, because of Hong Kong, a lot of Taiwanese people are much more against, being part of anything related regarding the mainland China. But back then it was just like, oh, well, yeah, like there was a lot more of this, like, oh, we're like, related, we're family, we should be trading and having more closer relations. And that was the zeitgeist at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even though, I feel like the Hong Kong sacrifice was not in vain.
I mean, I don't
By
know if
any
that's
means.
really comforting to all the people we know who are currently in prison. And
Yeah.
yeah,
But
it's,
I
yeah.
mean, that's, China, the Chinese Communist Party is like a big giant. It takes more than one hit to take them down.
Sorry,
I'm-
now I'm thinking of like you playing, what was it, Skyrim?
Uh huh.
And there was like those big giants,
giants.
and you kept getting completely creamed.
Well, I was specifically thinking about Dragon Ball Z,
Okay.
where they first are fighting the Saiyans, and Piccolo says to Gohan, it's like chopping down a big tree. It takes more than one swing.
There you go.
A lot of lessons.
In Dragon Ball Z.
Yeah. Thank you, Akira Toriyama. R.I.P. Rest in power.
Cool.
So foreign investment. Yes,
We have not learned that lesson.
that's true. The Chinese economy is not doing well. As I think this is a good time to your point about how the UN depends on foreign investment.
Yeah, I mean, China's entire economy. Well, the fundamental problem with the Chinese economy is that state-controlled economies don't do well because they squash innovation and creativity and competitiveness, and therefore it's a very inefficient
I
system.
mean, they basically create giant bureaucracies
Right.
to continue running.
Right,
yeah.
and so bureaucracies are by nature inefficient, and so
And
like-
then if you have like a politically motivated, like an ideologically motivated bureaucracy, I think that's also even worse because then people are making decisions according to saving their skin politically and not making
Right.
decisions.
I think we're
according
kind
to-
of seeing that in the U.S. with all the DEI stuff.
where a lot of it is kind of essentially decision making that's not in the best interest of the business or like
Or the consumer.
university.
Yeah, you
or-
get these ESG scores, so it's like this measurable thing. So companies like need to get investment by like fulfilling these ideological things like DEI, and so they put emphasis on this because that's how they get investment.
But like the weird thing is that they self-impose that ESG stuff. Yeah, like anyway.
Yeah. Well, so a simple example of why communist systems are inefficient is centralization. So, like the idea, just to illustrate this really simply, you have 1,000 farmers who don't get to own their crops. It all belongs to the central government, and so they have to send the crops in, put them on a train, they send them out, and then those get redistributed across the country. So you're basically sending them in. There's a bureaucracy, and they take a cut because they need to pay for the bureaucracy and feed those people, and then they send it back out. So now you've lost some to the bureaucracy and some to the transport, right? So even if there's no corruption at all, you have a major efficiency problem compared to farmers being able to grow and eat their own food, all right? So that's why this illustrates why communist systems are economically not particularly viable. So how do they sustain is by getting foreign investment. At least that's what the Chinese Communist Party realized after the fall of the Soviet Union. And they kind of knew this
they
before.
knew this before. They were running out of money in the 70s. Like
Right.
this is why reform and opening up happened.
Right. I mean, there was an absolute economic disaster under Mao for many different, basically his whole time was a disaster. There was the Great Famine, Cultural Revolution. Just nothing got done. So yeah, they were, Deng Xiaoping and his Southern tour in the 80s, was all of this, or actually late 70s, I think. Yeah, the Gaiga Kaifeng was 78 or 79
So
or
yeah,
something.
reform and opening up started in 78.
Right. And so they needed this sort of like IV line to sustain them. And they have done an amazing job of tricking the West into thinking that if they just put money into China, they're, I'll win big if I invest in China. And
There's a billion customers in China. Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
Even just a fraction of that.
and so what's funny is that for the great majority of foreign companies that invested in China, they're not getting a positive return.
It's interesting. There was an article in the Financial Times last week about how foreign firms are having trouble pulling their money out of China.
Oh, surprised that the CCP wouldn't want them to do it. And this goes back to the currency thing, which is that China essentially pegs its currency to the US dollar. And now they say they've let it float for the last, couple decades. But the reality is that it's only allowed to float like 2% of whatever the target the government sets.
It's pegged to a basket of currencies.
Right.
Matt.
It's a basket that they keep like secret and control the value of. So it's stupid.
The point is that the CCP ultimately controls the value of the yuan.
Right. But in order to do that, they have to have large foreign currency reserves so that when there are fluctuations in other currencies, they can the Chinese authorities can maintain the value.
But
Yeah.
foreign investment is at a 30-year low in China, which is great because there's all these state-run media articles coming out about how it's just a Western lie, everything is great, but like that data comes from China's official Bureau of Statistics.
And you know that if that is what the Bureau of Statistics is saying, then the reality is much worse.
Right. It's actually the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, which is what David Day, who we had on our show, talked about. Yeah, SAFE. And they're like, and the way David Day put it, I thought was really interesting, which is that there's essentially two currencies. There's like the one that they trade with the West, and then there's their fake useless script that they issue in China.
The internal domestic yuan and the offshore yuan. Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting way to think about it as well. But basically, it's a system propped up by lies, and also a system propped up by foreign investment. And so the CCP is freaking out about the loss of foreign investment, but they're not exactly addressing the reasons for the loss of foreign investment. And I think I'm surprised it took this long, but foreign companies are realizing how difficult it is to do business in China.
Only so many of your executives can get arrested in China before you start being like, maybe it's not a good idea to be there.
Only so much of your intellectual property be stolen by a Chinese company that creates a knockoff that's sold for cheaper and drives you out of business.
Right. I mean, remember, it was a long time ago, like a decade ago, the executive from Rio Tinto, the Australian mining company, was imprisoned. And like, even though he was an Australian citizen, he was ethnically Chinese, right? And then people were like, oh, this is bad. I'll issue a statement, but I'm going to keep doing business in China.
Yeah. Or even more recently, Apple, their iPhone market is huge in China. It's down precipitously this year, while sales for China's Huawei, which is basically kind of looks like the same phone, are way up. Is there a state hand in that, do you think?
It's just kind of like this was always going to happen at some point. It's just like, how long is that, how long can you make it in China before you'll be edged out by a domestic Chinese company, because that is what the Chinese state wants.
Right.
Like, it's never going to let Apple be the biggest cell phone, manufacturer in China. It's never going to let a foreign company be the biggest.
Right.
Yeah.
And because, it is common for executives and investors to have some element of greed and short-term thinking, it makes financial sense for a lot of them to have invested in China. And I'll give an example. Like, let's say you're put in charge of some, publicly listed manufacturing company, and you think, oh, I'm going to go to China and set up, it's going to be cheaper and all these things. And so the revenue projections, your profit projections go up, right? And so you're thinking, I'm going to be CEO for 5 years. I know that by going to China, it's going to increase the value of my stock and I'm going to make more money. I'm going to make more bonuses. Whatever that cash is, I get to keep, right? And I can cash out of my stock options. And of course, I have my salary. And in 5 years, I'm retired. I'm done, right?
It might not even take 5 years for them to destroy your company, though.
Right.
So I don't think that people were necessarily going in knowing that they were going to get screwed.
Right. But there's also then the Wall Street traders who were investing in things. And this is another thing where, like, I'm not saying that all Wall Street traders are bad or they're all greedy, but the way that they make money is typically they're getting like a percentage of your investment every year. Right? So if you invest $1 million with, some company, some stockbroker, they will get a percentage. If the value of your stock goes up, they get even more. If it goes down, they still get a cut. So the important thing to them financially is to just continue to get you to invest, right? So as long as they keep getting money to invest, they're going to make money. And it's not as important as whether their own individual investors and their 401ks were putting money. It doesn't matter what happens to them exactly. And like if they're moral, sure, that's the most important thing. But a lot of them are just like, well, this is about the money. And that has led, because there's so much of that, it's led to just this investment in China at all costs because it seems good on the surface.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, the 401ks, like I forget the guy who came up with this idea, but years ago, like there was all of this money sitting in U.S. pension funds and whatnot that were just kind of sitting there earning interest in banks. And there was the idea of like, oh, we can take this money and actually invest it in like China and create a lot more money.
Pension funds have invested in the stock market for
Right.
like that's not new, but yeah, the idea that like China is the place to invest.
Then take it and put it into China.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that Financial Times article about how it's hard to pull money out of China, a lot of those it's pension funds.
Right. So why is it hard to pull money out of China?
Well, it was interesting because it was partly blaming Wall Street for this, but I don't think that's the real fundamental reason. I mean, I think the real fundamental reason is that the CCP does not want you to be able to pull your money out of China. They want to keep that foreign investment circulating inside the country because that is what they depend on to keep their economy running.
Right. So they'll use various. I'm not sure if the capital controls necessarily apply.
The capital controls don't comply to foreign investors, but it's kind of like, well, let's say you came into China in a joint venture with a Chinese company, right? Maybe it's very hard for you to pull out of that joint venture.
Like you can't sell off your half of it or something.
Yeah, or if you sell it off, you're gonna like the JV company might buy you out at like a very low price.
Well, that's what happened to some Korean automakers, right? They kind of got screwed as they pulled out.
You like if you cannot maybe you cannot pull your actual intellectual property out of China, like you're manufacturing whatever, like that's now not able to leave for various reasons.
Yeah. So in order to leave China, you have to basically take a big loss. It could be a loss of physical property. It could be a loss of capital. It could be a loss of intellectual property. Whatever it is. I mean, it could even be exit bans for some of your people, but
I mean, also there are things like if you've invested directly in Chinese companies, maybe you just can't get your money out, like
they just won't let you sell your stock.
Or like what if you invested in bonds, right, for Evergrande or something like that?
Oh,
like they're not going to pay those back. You're really screwed.
Yep.
But so this is where it is like Hong Kong. They're solving a short-term problem, but it's becoming clear that like you don't want to have your money in China, and that's why we're seeing 30-year low investment. We're seeing exports falling, and
yet China's hosting a development forum.
Well, they're desperately trying to get the money.
I mean, the development forum is not new. That's like something that they hold. But the news that came out is that Xi Jinping is going to be meeting with foreign CEOs, you know, like at the development forum.
Yeah, I mean, if those CEOs are allowed to shake hands with Xi Jinping, then they're definitely going to make money in China.
Yeah, if they can directly tell Xi Jinping that, like, they're concerned about these things, Xi Jinping is definitely going to change how China operates.
Right.
Like when Obama and Trump and Biden told him, no more fentanyl to the U.S.
Yeah, that definitely worked.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's why it took 3 presidents asking.
When Xi Jinping promised Obama that there would be no militarization of the islands on the South China Sea, because they were face to face, they, had this good conversation. It definitely worked.
Definitely.
But yeah, there's that. And then I think there's something else about China releasing new, I don't know if you would call it guidelines, but like a new plan to increase foreign investment, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's all like it's like 24-point plan that's all about things like, increased access to the technology and financial sectors, but they're all really vague. And
increased access. Oh, great. We'll let you give us more of your money.
yes.
Yeah. Like, yeah.
And I don't know if it's well, we'll see. I don't know if it's going to work the way it is because especially with the economy doing worse in China, you see what Xi Jinping is doing is trying to basically create more power for himself, making himself, I mean, he's getting rid of like the collective leadership thing that Deng Xiaoping used to trick everyone to thinking he was headed to reform. Xi Jinping has been talking, he's gotten rid of the collective leadership and talking about core leadership. And he's the core.
I mean, that's been going on for years now.
But it's constantly ramping up. And this was something I brought up in the David Day podcast that, like, what happens if China just can't keep this game going because it's not getting the kind of foreign investment? I think we're really going to see, the mask fall off, and we're going to see that China is a Marxist regime with nukes.
I thought you were going to say Xi Jinping's mask falls off, and underneath it's Winnie the Pooh.
You thought I was going to say that.
I actually did think you were going to say that.
Oh, Matt. I don't know.
I mean, it would have been clever, Chris. And I know it would have been clever because I thought of it.
Thank you for watching China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
Cut our losses.
Are we really ending there, Chris?
No, I'm kidding. We won't actually end there. We've got more to talk about. But on a similar note, there's that poll that just came out that 40% of Americans see China as the greatest enemy.
That's actually down.
It's down.
Is it down?
It's down from last year because the peak of it was like 50%, right? As like that after that spy balloon incident.
Oh,
But it's up from like 16% in 2011, which is before we started China Uncensored.
We have changed America. Da 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 da.
So, I mean, most of the credit obviously goes to you, Chris.
Oh, to us.
But also possibly there are some, external events outside of our control that have influenced this a little bit, like maybe the spy balloon
Yeah.
and COVID.
We've done nothing, have we?
This is what we were talking about how when we started the show in 2012, it was just like shouting into the void.
The
and now-
zeitgeist was against us.
Remember when
Yes.
people were like, Iran is the biggest threat.
I actually don't remember that.
But it was, though. That was like what it was 10 years ago. And then and Russia was like not really considered a big threat. I was looking at the survey data a couple days ago, so that's
Okay.
why I know.
Oh, that's what people believed back then.
Yes, like
Oh, okay.
the Gallup polls asking people like what is the single biggest foreign threat to America, and then it was like Iran was number one in 2011, followed by China at like a much smaller percentage, and then Russia was like 2%. It was like almost nothing.
What is it now?
Well, China is at 41%. Russia is next. I forget the percentage. And then Iran is like very low. Like nobody's talking about Iran right now because, when the U.S. is currently dealing with a Russian invasion of Ukraine, as well as obviously what's going on with Hamas and Israel, like it seems like those are maybe bigger threats, but it's actually, I think, because the media coverage of those things puts them in the zeitgeist. So people are just aware of them. It's top of mind awareness. That I think explains a lot of what's happening with China too, which is that the more and more people are aware of all the horrible things the CCP is doing, in a small part perhaps thanks to us, but in large measure thanks to like
the things the CCP is doing. Yeah.
We couldn't do it without them.
Yes.
We really couldn't. So should we say thank you, Chinese Communist Party? I mean, really, I'd rather not have to do this show. I think that's.
I mean, now I'm thinking of like that Star Trek reboot movie. Like, where would we be if the CCP never took over? What if Chiang Kai-shek had struck when the iron was hot and actually
Reinvaded or okay, yeah.
defeated Mao before he even took over? What would we be doing? What is the parallel universe where there was no CCP? What are we doing with our lives? Would we have even met? I don't know. Wow. Makes you think a little bit differently about the Chinese Communist Party.
So they've really brought us together.
Brought us together. Shelley, wow. I think I felt the wind from the eyes rolling back.
I don't know. I mean, I think my life would probably have been affected the most, honestly.
Oh yeah, that's true.
I don't know. I think it's all about me.
I mean, would I still be in China?
Yeah, that
maybe.
That could
Yeah.
be.
Like, would your parents have gone with you back to China if there was no Tiananmen Square massacre?
Yeah.
Well, not even that, because like the economic situation of China would be totally different if it had never gone through the Cultural Revolution.
That's true. I mean,
there wouldn't been a Geiger Kaifang.
Would my dad have needed a scholarship from the UN to study abroad? Like this whole thing, like what? Yeah, it just who knows? It would have been very different, right?
It's like I'm realizing we're in like that evil timeline in Back to the Future 2, where everything has gone wrong. It wasn't supposed to be like this.
Oh, and like Biff has this big casino.
They make him basically Trump, actually.
Yeah,
that's not my opinion. That's just that's how the movie presents Biff.
Right.
But yeah, we're in the evil dark timeline, so we need to use our science to go back in
to
time,
1955,
and prevent this setting right.
No, I think Chris is
wrong.
talking about going back to like 1945 and preventing like the 49 Civil War win of.
Yeah, when would you have to go back in time?
You'd have to prevent the Soviets from giving Mao that one like sports betting magazine.
That's what happened. They gave Mao the play-by-play book of like
that's what the
Japanese are
going to
come and oh my god, it makes perfect sense. Hitler was using his Nazi scientists to research time travel. The Soviets got the Nazi scientists and developed it. They went to it makes sense now.
Really, we need Indiana Jones, I think. Is what you're saying.
Oh, Indiana Jones. He's not in a good place anymore. I think this is actually because we're going to be playing the Alex Jones NWO game next, and so that got me in the mindset.
Wait, what? We're playing an Alex Jones game?
Yes.
I guess
not on this podcast.
Not on this podcast.
Just to be clear. Yeah.
On our other channel, Gamers Unbeaten.
So by the time that you're watching or listening to this, it'll already be out. So you can go to our Gamers Unbeaten channel.
I kind of feel like the Venn diagram of all of our channels, the Venn diagram between the people who watch China Unscripted and the ones who watch Gamers Unbeaten are probably the furthest apart.
Those circles do not touch.
The circles are the furthest apart.
Now, however, if you are watching this right now and you also watch Gamers Unbeaten, please let us know in the comments.
Yeah.
It'd be really interesting.
It would be interesting, actually. Yes.
So all three of you, please leave your comments below.
We'll actually craft out that Venn diagram. Well, I guess we can still talk about this ties into sort of the stupidity on China, the big AI conference, or it wasn't a conference, it's a safety dialogue they held in Beijing.
Yeah.
That is who I want to determine the safety of AI is definitely the Chinese Communist Party, just like they determined the safety of the internet. What could go wrong?
Well, it wasn't just Chinese scientists. It was they had a lot of Western scientists as well, AI scientists.
Keeps coming back to the scientists.
Right. Well, and so these wizards, They met it I think there are a lot of AI scientists around the world who are interested in AI and maybe even believe a lot in the positive applications of AI, but fear the dangerous applications of AI.
But also
And-
realize to build AI, you kind of need vast swaths of data that
Right.
China can deliver because they don't have any privacy
What
protection.
could go wrong with doing your AI research in China, honestly?
This actually reminds me of how, remember when Google, and this is probably 2006 or thereabouts, Google pulled out of China for and they had this excuse it's human rights and all this, and censorship, and they pulled out, and then they took a stand. But then, less than a decade later, we learned that they had been slowly reinvesting in China in AI research because China had all this enormous data on its own citizens that Google could tap into, by joint venturing, and train their AIs based on this mass surveillance program.
Oh, and look at how successful Google AI was.
Oh my God.
I mean, but I don't know if that explains how stupid and awful their AI
No.
is.
I think
No,
that's
that's for-
I think that's an internal Google issue.
Right.
That's
but-
for American issues.
Right. I mean, and I don't think that technology itself is good or evil. I don't think you can fit it into that category. It's just it is what it is. It does what it does, and depending on the intention of how people use it and how they program it, will affect what kind of results you get. So, if you're training an AI, and here's kind of a more extreme example, how do you stop terrorism? But you do it in communist China, where they define terrorism as all ethnic Uyghurs, and there's no restrictions on what you're allowed to do to stop people. An AI solution might be just well, I guess we'll just nuke the entire Xinjiang region, and that will stop all the terrorists, right? So I'm not saying that that's actually what would happen.
This example has really gone far.
Well, it has
be
gone far,
done.
but my point is that the CCP is already doing the things that without AI that AI is not supposed to be doing, right?
Well, I mean, I think you're saying that if the CCP trained AI, it would go towards more extreme, because the CCP solution to terrorism, quote unquote, is essentially to reprogram all Uyghurs.
Right. It's starts with mass surveillance, and then you can use AI to determine who has wrongthink, and then
Then you get into pre-crime territory, right?
Which is the party's already doing. They have technology that supposedly predicts if you're gonna commit a crime based on your facial features or your emotional state. If you're oh, God.
Yeah, I'm sure that works really
right.
well.
Yeah,
yeah.
probably
Right.
does.
because everyone except terrorists is very happy under the CCP.
That's true.
So then they identify people who are involved in wrongthink, and then they can put them in re-education, right? And so that's a great, from the CCP's perspective, a great use of AI. And Western scientists who are working with China in any capacity are essentially part of this system that the CCP is developing to use AI. CCP is not going to tell them that's how we're going to use it, but I mean, that's ultimately what is the CCP going to say? Oh, we promise not to use AI for mass surveillance or thought control. We promise we're not going to use it to militarize
Everything.
Everything.
Well, I mean, I think it's the same with. It's not just AI, right? You see this. This is what happened with the Wuhan Institute of Virology stuff, where a lot of scientists were what was that company they were working with? Eco
Health Alliance.
Health Alliance, right? They wanted to do this cutting edge research that they were promising was going to help prevent future pandemics, right? And who was willing to do things research all of these bat coronaviruses and play around with the spike
Humanized
proteins
mice.
and humanized mice and manipulate the viruses to be more, this is cutting edge science. And so from the perspective of this outside nonprofit. They're like, oh, this is cutting edge science, but like, what does the CCP want to do with it? Probably something much more nefarious than
I mean, there's already a lot of information
Yeah.
about China's bioweapons programs.
But so then you have this whole thing where Western scientists do become complicit in things that are just like, from their perspective, like we're just like adding to the scientific body of knowledge, but that is not what the CCP is doing. And they're not
evil
funding
wizards.
this because they're evil
Well, I mean,
wizards.
also like it's just the entire all the Western internet companies who went to China, they didn't give China access to the internet. They allowed the CCP to build the Great Firewall to create a internet prison for China.
But yeah, anything where it's like, okay, or the organ harvesting stuff, right? China on the cutting edge of organ transplant medicine.
Bleeding edge.
Yeah. So why? Because they have this.
They've had a lot of practice.
Yeah. Like, why are they suddenly building up all of these transplant hospitals and stuff when they don't have an organ donor database? It's because where are they getting the organs from? The International Transplant Society. Let's not look into that too closely.
Yep.
Right. I remember like we had Ethan Gutman on the podcast, and he was like, it used to be that they were harvesting organs from like millions of Falun Gong. Well, he didn't give the number, but basically all these Falun Gong practitioners, right? And because the ideal age is like 26 or something. And then like they harvested so many organs that they basically ran out of Falun Gong to harvest from. And then they've switched to Uyghurs. That was kind of the point he made. It's been a gradual switch, but now you have, because you've got, 10 million Uyghurs or whatever.
And when you run out of Uyghurs, there will be other people.
Right. I mean, you've got
Taiwan,
Tibetans, Southern Mongolians, but those aren't that big of population. So you have to do other types of people. But they will not run out of people to call dissidents to then persecute. Ultimately, I mean, they'll just go after anyone.
The problem is the U.S. is playing Stardew Valley. China's playing RimWorld. If anyone in watching gets that, let me know. You're a candidate for Gamers Unbeaten audience. That's actually it's a great analogy. Just so if you know those things, it's great.
Yeah.
I only know Stardew Valley and not RimWorld.
I'll make you play it someday,
great.
very soon.
Yes.
Well, anyway, I mean, so the organ harvesting is just another good example of like why we don't want our Western wizards working with Chinese wizards, because they're all in Slytherin.
So remember, Chris, how you jumped on the Harry Potter bandwagon like a decade late?
Yeah.
Matt is now jumping on the Harry Potter bandwagon like almost a decade later.
It was silly. They all Slytherin are evil. At least in the fanfic I read, like Moody, the crazy guy, he was a Slytherin in that. Like they made some good Slytherins.
I think that like according to canon, it was like Slytherins are supposed to be ambitious and creative, so they're not just evil.
But in practical application, they were all evil.
Yeah, it was like, well, let's make a school, and we'll sort them into houses, and one will be the evil house.
Yeah. That doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think J.K. Rowling is taking feedback at this point.
Oh, she gets lots of feedback.
She is. That's another topic. I mean, we're talking about AI in China.
You brought up Slytherin. Sorry,
I
Matt.
did.
And then I have to talk about Harry Potter because I have opinions about Harry Potter.
So does everyone.
Yep. Oh gosh, that's true. Yeah.
Even the Communist Party. They used Voldemort they compared the U.S. to Voldemort in this like series of I think it was actually they compared not NAFTA. NATO to Voldemort. Yes, thank you.
Really? Well, if we can find that, we'll be putting it on screen right now.
Yes, I definitely this is a couple years ago. I wrote this whole episode about it. They had this like series of like why NATO is so evil. This is after Russia invaded Ukraine.
Russia invades Ukraine. NATO's pretty evil.
Yes, and then like one of them was that like NATO and the U.S. has used NATO is like Voldemort, and it had an illustrated like thing of like the U.S. being Voldemort. It's great.
Wow, that's beautiful.
Wow. All right. Well, I think it's time for that salami sandwich. What do you guys think?
I think we've gone sufficiently off the rails with this last thing.
Oh, yeah. I'm hungry now.
And I want to play RimWorld. Thank you for watching China Unscripted. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Chung.
And I'm Matt Ganesta.
We'll talk to you next time.